There's a running back in fantasy who went from a dud to a stud. There's two quarterbacks who are goats, but you cannot trust them in fantasy, and a wide receiver who is a rookie but a touchdown machine. Let's talk about it.
You are now listening to the Rival Fantasy Sports Podcast. Let's go.
It's time for Rivals of the Week. We will not get to do many more of these, so we really got to make sure we enjoy the ones we have. This is where we give flowers to the fantasy players who dominated their positions last week. Always start with the quarterbacks, and at quarterback this week, we're starting with Dak Prescott, 347 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 41 rushing yards. He landed himself with 27.98 fantasy points. That is a heck of a game for Dak Prescott. There's not much more you can ask for from your fantasy quarterback. And I know there was a lot who really struggled, but there was also some really good quarterbacks this week, and Dak Prescott headlined at the top of them. Moving on to running back, this running back who had high hopes if he could bounce back from an injury coming into the season, fell on bad times, even requested a trade at one point, now was the best running back of the week in fantasy, and that's Cam Akers. He had 118 rushing yards, 2 receptions from 29 receiving yards, and 3 rushing touchdowns, landed him with 34.7 fantasy points in PPR scoring. It's feel good, right? Like, you can't feel any better for Cam Akers. It's awesome to see this. It's one of those rare situations where a player, goes into the season with a lot of hype. If he can, overcome this injury, he doesn't seem to, or at least the team doesn't feel like he does. They start putting him on the back burner. He requests a trade, so he got so bad that he didn't even want to play there anymore. And then he bounces back to this kind of relevance, where they made himself a rival of the week in fantasy. Not much more you can ask for. Piggybacking off of the Dak Prescott thing. So 10 receptions, 120 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 34 fantasy points. Again, when you have a quarterback like Dak Prescott who goes off, you have to assume on the other end of that, there's a wide receiver who, went off as well. In many cases, it may not always be where the quarterback is QB1 of the week and wide receiver 1 of the week, but in this case, you got the QB1 and the wide receiver 1 both on the same team. CeeDee Lamb living up to, lofty, expectations of him. So rightfully so, he finds his way here at the top of the leaderboard for Rivals of the Week, and it's a first time for him, I believe, here for us this season. So it's good to see. And then at tight end, this is an interesting one. A guy gets traded mid-year, goes from one explosive offense to another explosive offense, and he goes off this week, 13 receptions, 109 yards, 2 touchdowns, with a total of 35.9 fantasy points in PPR, and that is TJ Hawkinson. Yes, TJ Hawkinson, new Vikings tight end, used to be a Lions tight end, and he had a lot of, lofty expectations there as well. And he had his moments. He flashed here and there. For whatever reason it was, they traded him, and the Vikings really got lucky here this week. He really balled out. That offense in general with Kirk Cousins, Justin Jefferson, some other wide receivers who are also getting in the mix, depending on the week. Of course, Dalvin Cook. That offense is really scoring a lot of points, and it's a good thing because they're giving up a lot of points as well. But TJ Hawkinson got himself in the mix this week. It's really good to see a tight end score this much points. Actually, if you think about it, he scored more points than everyone on this list. He balled out of control, especially for a tight end, a position that we always say is very hit or miss. It's very hard to, get a consistent weapon each week outside of certain guys like Travis Kelce. And of course, like most guys on this list, most weeks, these guys are not going to repeat these kind of things. TJ Hawkinson is the most likely not to repeat this kind of thing. Again, just because, tight end is this position that goes up and down, up and down. But welcome to the Rivals of the Week, TJ Hawkinson. Again, just to repeat, quarterback Dak Prescott, running back Cam Akers, wide receiver CeeDee Lamb, tight end TJ Hawkinson. Congratulations to you guys. And if you had these guys, I'm assuming you did really well in your fantasy playoff game or your fantasy championship, whichever one it may have been. If you have fantasy championships at this point going forward, it gets really ugly for you sometimes because, teams start benching players or they shove players for the year. And so it gets hard to try to, get your best players in your lineup at this point. But last week, if it was your championship and you had one of these players, I know you at least contended really well. And if the rest of the team did well, they got you over the hump, hopefully, and got you to a championship. If not, of course, we have information going for this fantasy football week as well. Let's talk about some other stuff here. Now, 3 things we learned for week 17. These are the things that you're going to apply that we learned just last week or prior weeks as well, but especially last week. These are things that you're going to carry over again into your fantasy championships if you have it this week. I really hope you don't have a fantasy championship in week 18 because then it gets even uglier. But if you have it for week 17, you're going to apply it here. This may be your fantasy championship game. The first thing that we learned is that Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers cannot be trusted anymore. At this point, in fantasy, there's just better options, right? Like there's just guys who are playing better, and you just have to trust them. You just have to stay away from these two if you have the choice. If you have an option for a guy who's been on fire the last few weeks, he's been carrying, he's been scoring a bunch of points on your bench. You just have to make the move. You have to. Now, of course, if you have no other, better situation or it's super risky, then you can still go with these guys because like Tom Brady, for instance, I want to say is somewhere like in the 15, 16 range right now at quarterback, 14, somewhere in there. It's not the end of the world if you have to start one of these guys, but it's just not, it's just not the best situation to be in. So if you're at this point in the season now and you've got this far, you probably hopefully aren't starting one of these two. But if you do, you may have another option that's better. And I would just take that gamble over going with these guys because these guys' upside at this point is really low. Thing number 2 that we learned from last week is that Cam Akers is back. Yes, he is back. Cam Akers is back in the mix. We talked about it just now on Rivals of the Week. He was on there for quarterback, over 100 yards, got some receptions in. Not a lot. I still want to see more receptions, tons of touchdowns. Obviously, you can't expect this stuff on a week-to-week basis from him. It's just not, predictable. It's not something that you can depend on week to week in terms of those kind of numbers, but you can still, put more faith in him having success on a regular basis. This guy has gone through the ups and downs, just like a lot of us have in fantasy. A lot of your favorite teams have, a lot of your favorite players have, but it's good to see him come out the other side, still productive, still, in a good place, and in a place where the Rams are probably thankful they didn't trade him because they probably wouldn't have got anything in return near that type of production that you get out of a Cam Akers. So yes, he's back. Yes, you can trust him. Yes, he's the guy that if you're in dynasty leagues, I would start to target. You could have targeted him prior to this, but you can start to target him and try to see if you can get him away from the league manager who has him right now. Don't pay too much. Don't pay at this peak price. Just try to, wiggle your way in there and see if you can get, him in a place where there's still people who don't believe in him, don't have faith in him, don't think he'll carry this role over to next year. And so you try to get into that mix and trade for him. But if you have him on your team, yeah, you could definitely trust him, definitely get him in your starting lineups and try to get yourself a championship. The last thing that we learned that we're going to apply to week 17, and you can apply this each season that you play in fantasy football, especially towards the middle to end of the year, and it's trust what the players and teams have showed you all along this season. Guys like Jahan Dotson, George Pickens, Eagles offense, Daniel Jones, Evan Ingram. These are all players or teams that people questioned, that they weren't sure about. And even in the case of George Pickens, when I say Raiders, it's more so like George Pickens played the Raiders. I talked about it last week. I said this is a good matchup for George Pickens. The Raiders secondary has been weak. The defense has given up a lot of plays to wide receivers. Just trust that, believe that. Even if George Pickens' offense has been great and it has been rolling, it was a perfect opportunity for him to have one of those flash plays, get himself a touchdown, get in the end zone, that kind of stuff. So these are the kind of things you have to believe. Jahan Dotson scoring touchdowns, believe in him. The Eagles offense, with or without Jalen Hurts, believe in it right now, especially in a fantasy perspective. Daniel Jones, believe that he's really this good. Evan Ingram, he's a guy who has proved throughout the year that he can stay consistent and do really well and have these flashy games. He's done it. Believe in it. Don't just because of the player's name or his past history or his last team or his last situation. Don't let that get inside your thought process. Trust if these guys have been proving it over and over and over that they're like this, believe it. And it goes for good players and bad players. If someone's proved them in bad over and over and over, believe them. And if someone's proved they've been good over and over and over, believe them, use it, apply it, win your leagues. The last thing I want to touch on, I know it's only 3 things that we learned, but we always want to talk about the significant injuries here in this section as well. Greg Dulcich, Christian Watson, and Tua are the 3 that we come away with that I think are the most significant. Tua being the worst case scenario, mostly because the other guys are going to get over their injuries at some point. But the Tua stuff is scary. He had another concussion or concussion symptoms and all this kind of stuff. So it's getting weird. It's getting ugly. He's had a lot of this going on this year. You don't want this to be a common thread for him, a common theme for him. And you hate to see players go through this kind of stuff. You hate to see players go through injuries in general. Concussions are even more strange and hard to manage and deal with, and could end players' careers. So you hope that this doesn't happen. You hope that this is nothing super significant or something that becomes a real issue in his career in general, and that he can get past this crazy phase that he's going through right now. All in all, it's concerning just for the guy in general, just for his general health. But if I was someone who had Tua on my team, I would definitely look to replace him. I would look to find a quarterback to fulfill, his spot, because I just can't trust him anymore. So if you could trade him, if there's someone who really believes in him still, like at a high level, I would definitely sell him to that person. If you can't find someone to buy him at a decent value, I wouldn't go too low on it. Then I would just try to find a replacement any other way I could. This way I have a backup option just in case, this Tua thing gets out of hand and gets worse, as some people think it may. So those are the things that we learned to apply to week 17. Week 17, top 5 player stock changes, the values that have changed from week 16 going into week 17. We'll start with some stock ups. The first one is Jahan Dotson. I love this guy. I've been a fan of him coming into the league, the way he was balling out early on. He looked like he was showing some real signs of real ability out there. He's a touchdown machine. At this point, he's tied for the last week, he tied his most targets on the season. The last 3 weeks were his most targets, like in general, in the whole season. Those were the 3 best weeks that he's had. So he did have 1 week early on. I want to say he had 9 then as well, earlier in the season. But since then, these last 3 weeks have been his most productive weeks just from a target standpoint. So not only is he a touchdown machine and getting you touchdowns on a week to week basis at this point, he's also increasing in targets, which only increases your odds of more touchdowns, increases the odds in your favor that he's going to get touchdowns, but also just the rest of the stuff that he's not doing, like the receptions and all these other kind of things. The more targets he gets, the more he's going to see an uptick in all of these things. I mean, the team is believing in him more. The quarterbacks trust him more. So it's not, and the touchdowns are what helps that, because if a player only gets a couple of targets a game, and that couple of those targets always end up in a touchdown for him, it's hard not to trust that guy. It's hard not to believe that guy is a playmaker. It's hard not to believe that guy needs more targets. And so Jahan Dotson is doing that. Stock up. Tight ends in general, stock up. 4 of the top 12 fantasy players in week 16 were tight ends. 4, 4, 4, 4. 4 of the top players in fantasy this week, production and PPR, were all tight ends. They are alive. They are living. Use them. Respect them. Get yourself a good one, because they are out here scoring tons of points in the fantasy playoffs and in fantasy championships. So tight ends in general, you don't always get enough respect. We talk about the volatility between you guys, but tight ends, stock up in general. We gotta show love when we see it. We gotta show love. AJ Brown, I'm saying stock up. And it's not because, I mean, his stock couldn't go any further up in general, as it is. He's already super far on top of the wide receiver rankings, on top of your projections, on top of everything. AJ Brown is way up there, right? Like, how much higher can you ask the guy to go? But it's not even that. It's more about AJ Brown being bulletproof when it comes to quarterbacks. Tannehill, no problem. Jalen Hurts, obviously no problem. Gardner Minshew, no problem. AJ Brown is going to score. He's going to get you fantasy points. He's going to be at the top of the league, at the level of the wide receiver rankings every week, no matter who the quarterback is. He is the go-to guy. He is to be trusted every single week. I hope you weren't out here going, hey, Jalen Hurts is the man. He's out, so I don't trust AJ Brown. So I'm going to bench him. I hope you didn't do that. I know you guys are better than that. I know you're smarter than that. You wouldn't be listening to this show if you weren't smarter than that. But in general, just for someone who may have thought that, or second guessed themselves, or even kind of played with the idea, do not bench AJ Brown no matter what. So stock up even higher, if it could go any higher than his current stock value. For stocks down, Raiders offense. You heard the news. Derek Carr has been benched. He will be inactive for the last 2 games of the year. Possibly his last, playing with the Raiders at all would have been last week against the Steelers. So this team is a mess. They're going against 2 opponents the next 2 weeks. 49ers, best defense in the NFL right now. They got the Chiefs coming up after that. Jarrett Stidham is the quarterback. This is definitely a stock down situation. Now, I will still start guys like Josh Jacobs and Devontae Adams. Darren Waller, sure, because tight ends are just like that. But I wouldn't, go outside of that. I just wouldn't trust it at this point. You got to see what Jarrett Stidham can do. He's playing a tough defense as it is. But this just is real ugly. You feel bad for Derek Carr. We'll see how the situation plays out, and we'll cover that more in future episodes. But for right now, Raiders offense in general, stock down. The last one here on the list for stock down is Isaiah Pacheco. Not his fault necessarily. The reason I have him here on the list is more so the Chiefs offense leaves a lot to be desired from running backs, from true running backs. Not the Jerick McKinnon type who are getting a lot of receptions out of the backfield, but the true running backs, while they show that they're getting yards and while they're being productive, it's hard for them to get touchdowns. It's hard for them to really blow up and crush it as like a top 5 running back for the week, top 3 running back for the week. The potential is hard to get to just because the passing ball is going to Jared McKinnon and other wide receivers and tight end Travis Kelce, and they just don't commit to the run enough. So by default, it's stocked down for Isaiah. I know a lot of people are big fans of him and what he does, but it has to be stocked down by default for me. Shout out to the viewers on YouTube. If you want to support the show, the easiest way to do that is hit the subscribe button. We appreciate it greatly. If you could leave a comment, if you have any questions, we'll definitely interact with you there. Share us with a friend. Get us out there in the algorithm so we can help spread this information to more audience out there. Don't forget to turn on your notifications so you don't miss these episodes when they drop. We also drop clips. We drop shorts. You want to be on the receiving end of all that, and you know exactly when it drops. This way you don't miss any important information, especially for fantasy football. Love everyone who's listening on Apple Podcasts and watching or listening on Spotify. We really appreciate you. Same thing there. Hit subscribe, leave a review. We greatly appreciate it. As always, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all at Rival Fantasy, RIVALFANTASY on every single platform. Let us know you're a listener when you follow us. You send us a DM or a message or a tweet or whatever you're doing, whatever platform it is, and we'll follow you back. Most importantly, visit rivalfantasy.com, create an account, make a deposit, and start having fun while you're enjoying your games. We have a sweet promo running right now, 100% loss protection, up to $50 after your first deposit. Use the promo code RIVAL, RIVAL, and you automatically get it activated just like that. It's that simple. And again, we have on there, we have challenges. We have Fantasy Book, which is over under on fantasy points. And then we have Fantasy Bingo. If you need any further explanation on it, you can check. We have the videos up here on the YouTube. It might pop up here somewhere on the screen for you. And that'll give you a further explanation on how fun it is, how to play, how to win money, all that good stuff. Other than that, guys, I am out. Catch the next episode for waivers, bold predictions, not so obvious locks of the week, and everything else that you love. This is Rival Fantasy. I'm out.